The most expensive private home ever built in America once sat empty on the coast of Florida, and nobody wanted it. Buyers walked away, the state of Florida passed, and so did the government of the United States, which had been handed the entire estate for free. 126 rooms, 17 acres of oceanfront in Palm Beach, built by the richest woman in the country at the absolute peak of her fortune. When she died and left it to the nation as a gift, the nation looked at the bill and gave it right back. Her name was Marjorie Merriweather Post, and the house was called Mar-a-Lago. It cost around $7 million to build in the 1920s, which is well over $100 million in today's money, and she meant for it to become a winter White House, a place where American presidents would host the world. Instead, it became the single most famous piece of real estate that money could not give away. By the time the government was finished with it, the estate was listed for sale at $20 million, and there were no takers. The town of Palm Beach approved a plan to knock it down and carve the land into ordinary building lots. The greatest house in America was one signature away from becoming a row of empty parcels. This is a story about the kind of fortune almost none of us will ever inherit, and what quietly happens to it anyway. Because Marjorie Post did not lose her money the way you'd expect. She was never swindled, and she never gambled it away. She died one of the wealthiest women in America, with her family name still on grocery shelves in every kitchen in the country. So how does someone that rich end up with a palace nobody will take, even when the price is nothing at all? Half a century before that demolition plan, Marjorie was a young girl in Battle Creek, Michigan, sitting in on her father's business meetings and watching a fortune get built by the man building it. Her father was Charles William Post, and in 1895 he started a small company selling a coffee substitute made from roasted grain. He called it Postum. Battle Creek at the time was the strange capital of America's health food craze, a town full of sanitariums and cereal experiments, and Post threw himself right into the middle of it. Plenty of people thought his product was a ridiculous idea, a hot drink with no coffee in it, sold to Americans who loved their coffee. But Post was a marketer ahead of his time, and Postum sold. Then came a cereal called Grape Nuts, then Post Toasties. And within a decade, the Postum Cereal Company was one of the great success stories of American food, run out of a town that would soon call itself the cereal capital of the world. Marjorie grew up inside that rise. Her father brought her into the business while she was still a child, walked her through the factory floor, and taught her how the money moved and where it came from. By every account, she was the sharpest student he could have asked for. And then, in 1914, C.W. Post died, and everything he had built landed on the shoulders of a 27-year-old woman. She inherited around $20 million. In the money of 1914, that was a staggering sum, roughly the equivalent of $500 million today. At 27, Marjorie Merriweather Post was one of the richest people in the United States, and one of the very few of them who was a woman. Keep in mind the era. Women in America could not yet vote, could not sit on most corporate boards, and often could not even sign their own contracts without a husband's name beside theirs. And here was Marjorie, holding the reins of a national company outright. Her biographer would later title the definitive account of her life, American Empress. And the title fit. Here's the detail almost everyone missed at the time. She didn't sit back and collect the dividends, she grew the thing. And she did it across a personal life that turned over 4 times, because Marjorie married 4 husbands, and each marriage became, in its own way, a chapter of the fortune. The first, to a Greenwich investment banker, came before the real money and gave her 2 daughters. The second is the one that built the empire. The third took her onto the world stage. The fourth was a late companion. But it was that second marriage that mattered most to the money. Her second husband was a Wall Street financier named Edward Francis Hutton, whose name would sit atop one of the most famous brokerage houses in the country. Together, they went on a buying spree. Jell-O, Baker's chocolate, Maxwell House coffee of all things, folded in right beside the coffee substitute her father had built his company to replace. In 1929, they reorganized the whole enterprise under a new name that would sit in American pantries for the rest of the century, General Foods. That same year, they made the bet that turned a cereal company into a giant. An inventor named Clarence Birdseye had figured out how to flash freeze food so it still tasted fresh when it thawed, and nobody had cracked frozen food at scale before. The story goes that Marjorie tasted a frozen goose Birdseye had prepared and understood at once what she was looking at. General Foods bought the frozen food operation for around $22 million, and with it, essentially invented the modern frozen food aisle. The company Marjorie had inherited as a breakfast brand now reached into dinner, dessert, and the freezer. By the middle of the century, she was often called the wealthiest woman in America, and she was far more than a businesswoman. In Washington, she became the great hostess of her age, a woman some called the Queen of Washington, whose invitations ranked just below an invitation to the White House itself. She threw legendary galas, and fortunes went out the door to charity, funding a Red Cross field hospital in the First World War, paying for Salvation Army feeding stations during the Depression, backing the National Symphony, and helping bring the Kennedy Center into being. So she did what the very rich have always done with a fortune this size. She built monuments to it. This is where the seeds of the whole collapse got planted. Though nobody watching her lay marble would have believed it, because everything Marjorie built was breathtaking, and almost none of it was built to pay for itself. Start with the crown jewel. In the mid-1920s, on the strip of Palm Beach, where the Atlantic meets a saltwater lagoon, she commissioned Mar-a-Lago. The name means sea to lake. She hired a society architect and a Viennese stage designer, and told them, in effect, to spare nothing. They shipped in Dorian limestone from Genoa, in boatloads, and stripped tiles and marble from an old Cuban castle. When it was done, Mar-a-Lago had 126 rooms across more than 60,000 square feet, a great gilded hall, cloisters, a golf course, and a tower you could see the whole island from. It remains one of the largest private homes ever built in the United States. The construction alone took 3 years and roughly 1,500 workers. What she did not have, and what nobody thinks about while the scaffolding is still up, was any way for a house on that scale to earn back a fraction of what it swallowed. It was a masterpiece and a money pit in the same set of blueprints. And Mar-a-Lago was only the beginning. In Washington, she kept a grand estate called Hillwood, filled with French and Russian art. Up in the Adirondacks, she owned Camp Topridge, a wilderness retreat of some 300 acres, with dozens of buildings, and its own Russian-style lodge, where guests were flown in to rough it in absolute luxury. And on the water she owned the Sea Cloud, the largest private sailing yacht in the world at the time, a 4-masted ship with a crew of dozens and staterooms trimmed like a European palace. Marjorie could afford to build all of it without blinking. What almost nobody said out loud was what it would cost to keep, year after year, long after the woman who loved it was gone. There's one more monument to add, and it's the strangest of all, because it ties Marjorie to a fallen dynasty, far older and far bloodier than her own. In 1937, her third husband, a lawyer named Joseph Davies, was appointed United States ambassador to the Soviet Union, and Marjorie went with him to Moscow. She arrived at an extraordinary moment. The Soviet government was broke, desperate for hard currency to fund its factories and its army, and it was doing something almost unthinkable. It was selling off the treasures it had seized from the murdered Russian imperial family, the Romanovs, whose entire dynasty had been wiped out in the revolution 20 years earlier. The crown jewels of a slaughtered royal house were being sold cheap to pay for tractors, and Marjorie Merriweather Post, the serial heiress from Battle Creek, was standing right there with the money to buy. She acquired Russian imperial porcelain, icons, silver, and close to 90 objects by the court jeweler Fabergé, among them 2 of the famous imperial Easter eggs. To this day, her collection at Hillwood is the finest assembly of Russian imperial art anywhere outside of Russia itself. There's a myth worth clearing up here, because you'll hear it repeated. People say Marjorie Post dined with Stalin. She did not. It was her husband, the ambassador, who dealt with the Soviet leadership. Marjorie's part in Moscow was the collecting, the quiet transfer of a dead dynasty's crown jewels into an American heiress's hands. And that matters, because it's the whole story in miniature. Here's the mechanism underneath all these beautiful objects. A monument does not make money. Mansions earn nothing. A yacht pays no dividends. A case of Fabergé eggs sits behind glass, and does nothing but demand insurance, guards, and climate control. When you pour a fortune into things like these, you aren't storing your wealth. You're converting it into something that costs money to own, every single day, forever. There's an old phrase for this kind of possession: a white elephant. The term comes from a story about the kings of old Siam who would hand a rare white elephant to a courtier they wanted to ruin. The animal was sacred, so you couldn't put it to work, and you couldn't give it away or harm it. You simply had to feed it and house it and care for it until the cost drained you dry. A gift that was a curse in disguise, dressed up as an honor. Mar-a-Lago was a white elephant the size of a city block. Running that estate cost something close to $1 million a year in 1970s money, just to keep the lights on and the roof intact, and it took a small army of gardeners to hold the Florida jungle back from the grounds. Nothing about it generated a dime of income. Marjorie could carry that cost with ease, because she still had an enormous river of money flowing from General Foods. But a fortune is a living thing. It flows down to the people who inherit it, and it splits, and it thins. The question hanging over every great fortune is not whether the founder can afford the monuments, it's whether anyone after them can. And Marjorie Post, for all her brilliance, made the one decision that guaranteed the answer would be no. She decided to give the monuments away. Ask yourself something here. If someone handed you a palace for free, 126 rooms on the ocean, would you take it? Hold that thought, because almost everyone offered this one said no, and their reasons are the whole point of the story. Marjorie was a genuine patriot, and as she grew older she began to think about legacy in the grandest possible terms. She didn't want Mar-a-Lago to become just another rich family's beach house after she was gone. She wanted it to serve the country. So in her will, she left Mar-a-Lago to the United States government. The idea was beautiful on paper. The estate would become a winter White House, a place where American presidents could receive kings and prime ministers against the backdrop of the sea. She died in 1973 and handed her greatest creation to the American people. And the American people, once they saw what it cost, did not want it. The problem was the one nobody had solved. A gift of a building is not really a gift if it comes with a bill the recipient can't pay. The federal government looked at Mar-a-Lago and saw close to $1 million a year in upkeep, with no way to earn it back. Officials also saw a security nightmare, an enormous open estate with a long shoreline, sitting right under the flight path of the Palm Beach airport, with planes roaring over the roof every few minutes. President after president took one look and preferred to vacation somewhere simpler. The winter White House hosted no one. It just sat there, magnificent and empty, draining money out of the treasury for a purpose it never once served. Then the same thing happened to her second great gift. Marjorie had also left her Washington estate, Hillwood, with all its Russian and French treasures, to the Smithsonian Institution, along with an endowment to help run it. The Smithsonian accepted, then did the math. The money she'd left behind didn't cover what the estate cost to operate. And in 1976, the Smithsonian's governing board voted to give Hillwood back to her foundation. The nation's own museum looked at Marjorie Post's gift and returned it. Then came the third. Camp Topridge, the Adirondack retreat, she left to the state of New York. The state kept the wild land and folded most of the acreage into its forest preserve, but the buildings were pure cost, so it sold the developed heart of the camp to a private buyer for a fraction of what it would take to build, and washed its hands of the upkeep. One by one, the treasures Marjorie had built to last forever were handed back or sold off, not because they weren't beautiful, but because beauty doesn't pay a heating bill. Mar-a-Lago, the greatest of them all, had the hardest fall. After the government returned it to her foundation around 1980, the estate went on the market, and it sat. The asking price was $20 million, and buyer after buyer walked away, because whoever bought it would inherit the exact same white elephant that had scared off the United States government. 3 separate deals fell apart. The house was so unwanted that the town of Palm Beach approved a plan to demolish it and subdivide the oceanfront into ordinary building lots. The most expensive home in America, that palace of imported limestone and gilded ceilings, came within a signature of the wrecking ball. In the mid-1980s, it finally sold for around $10 million, a fraction of what Marjorie had spent to build it half a century before, and about half the original asking price. The crown jewel of one of the great American fortunes changed hands for less than the value of the land and the stone underneath it. That is what a white elephant is worth in the end, not what you paid for it. whatever someone will take to relieve you of the burden. So the palace survived, in the hands of others. But the real question we started with is still sitting there. How does a woman this rich end up with monuments the country won't even accept as gifts? To answer that, you have to stop following the buildings and start following the money, because the money tells a quieter and more important story. Here's the part people get wrong about Marjorie Post. She did not die broke, not even close. When she passed in 1973, her worth still sat somewhere around $200 million, which is close to $1.5 billion in today's money. By any normal measure, the fortune was intact. She stayed rich to the very end, and gave fortunes away to the Red Cross, the Boy Scouts, the symphony, and the arts. The collapse was never in the size of the fortune, it was in its shape. Because a fortune spent on monuments and then split among heirs does something very different from a fortune kept together and put to work. Marjorie's money, at her death, went in 3 directions, to her 3 daughters, along with her foundations and her charities. 3 heirs, 3 shares, and that was the beginning of the thinning. Watch what happened just 1 generation down. Her daughter Eleanor died years later, leaving an estate of around $74 million, itself a great deal of money. But that estate did not pass to anyone in one piece. It dissolved into a tangle of competing claims and lawsuits that stretched across several countries, with lawyers and tax collectors carving off a slice from every direction. The money did not compound, it scattered, and a great deal of it simply evaporated into fees and taxes and the friction of being fought over. That's the pattern. Split, split again, tax, fee, then sell the thing that costs too much to keep. The founder's mountain of money becomes a range of hills, then a scatter of stones. There's even an old proverb for it, the one they say applies to nearly every great fortune, from shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations. The first generation builds it, the second enjoys it, and the third is back where the family started. The one thing that could have broken that curse, Marjorie never built. She never built a machine to hold the fortune together. Think about what she owned at the end. Palaces, art, a yacht, jewels, beautiful static things that only take money to keep. What she did not own, by the end, was control of the company. Her stake in General Foods had thinned and spread across the decades as the business grew and changed hands, and she stepped down from its board in the late 1950s. The family didn't run the company anymore. So when General Foods was sold to Philip Morris in 1985 for around $5.5 billion, understand what that number actually means. That was the price the corporation fetched on the open market, 12 years after Marjorie died, paid out to public shareholders. It was not the family's money. The Posts did not collect $5 billion. By then, the family and the company that carried its name had long since gone their separate ways. That's the whole story in one line. She built the most valuable things in America and kept the least valuable kind of wealth. She kept the monuments and let go of the engine. Now, if the story ended there, it would just be a sad little tale about a rich woman and some expensive houses. But it's more useful than that, because right in the same era, other families faced the exact same trap and beat it. Go up into the mountains of North Carolina to a house that makes even Mar-a-Lago look modest. Biltmore, the 250-room chateau the Vanderbilts built in the 1890s, still the largest private home in America. By the middle of the 20th century, Biltmore was caught in the very same trap, a white elephant bleeding money. By 1960, the estate was losing $250,000 a year, and the family could have done what Marjorie's heirs did, hand it to the government, sell it off, or let it fall down. Instead, a Vanderbilt grandson named William Cecil came home and made a decision that changed everything. He refused to treat Biltmore as a monument. To him it was a business, and it would earn its keep or it would not stand. The work was slow and humbling. In 1968, after years of grinding, Biltmore turned its first annual profit, and do you know how much it was? $16.34. Not 16,000, not 16 million, $16. For a house that size, that was either the most pathetic profit in American history or the most important, depending on whether you grasped what it proved. It proved the thing could stand on its own 2 feet, and it grew from there. In 1985, the very same year Mar-a-Lago was being sold off for scrap, William Cecil opened a winery at Biltmore. Today, the estate takes in more than $200 million a year, every dollar of it earned and put back into the place, with no government grants and no rescue. The house is still standing. It is still in the family, all because someone built an engine underneath the monument instead of just admiring it. Biltmore isn't the only example. Look at the DuPont family, who made a fortune in gunpowder and chemicals older than the Post fortune by a century. Back in 1915, the DuPonts did something Marjorie never did. They created a private holding company, a plain, unglamorous vehicle whose entire purpose was to hold the family's controlling stake in the DuPont company all in one place, so it couldn't thin out and scatter across the heirs. It was boring, and it was brilliant. It kept close to a third of a giant company locked in family hands for more than 60 years. The Rockefellers did the same thing with a different tool. They built family trusts in the 1930s, and a private family office to manage the money as one body, across generation after generation. The Standard Oil fortune has now passed through 6 generations and still holds together across dozens of heirs because it was never allowed to shatter into 100 separate inheritances the way Marjorie's did. Compare that to the Vanderbilts, on the other side of the ledger, the family that built Biltmore in the first place. They went from the richest family in America to a reunion where, by some accounts, not a single person in the room was a millionaire. Same starting fortune, opposite ending. The difference was never the size of the pile. It was whether anyone built the machine. And the idea behind all of these is the same, and it isn't complicated. You keep the wealth in one working body instead of cutting it into slices. A holding company owns the shares, so no single heir can sell them off. A trust holds the assets and pays out only the income, while the core stays whole. A family office runs the money like a business, answerable to the whole family rather than to one spender in one generation. It's unglamorous work. Nobody builds a museum to a trust document. But that plain document is the thing that outlives the marble. The families who lasted did not build the biggest house. They built the boring machine underneath it. So think back to where we started. The most expensive home in America, sitting empty, listed for a fraction of its worth, one signature away from the bulldozer. It was not empty, because Marjorie Post ran out of money. She had money to the very end. The palace stood empty because she had built a thing that only knew how to cost, and left it to a country that finally did the math, the way the smart families always do. What is this actually worth to keep? And the answer, for a monument with no engine, is almost always less than you think. The Gilded Age is full of these ghosts. The Vanderbilts alone built a row of marble palaces up Fifth Avenue in New York. Monuments meant to announce a dynasty that would never end. And by the 1940s, almost every one of them had been torn down and replaced with office towers, because even the Vanderbilts couldn't carry them. Right there in Palm Beach, the great mansions thrown up in the same boom as Mar-a-Lago earned the same nickname, White Elephants, and the wrecking crews took them down one after another through the 1950s and 60s. Palaces of the richest families in America, gone, not to war or scandal, but to the plain grinding arithmetic of upkeep. Marjorie Merriweather Post was sharper than most, kinder than most, and richer than almost anyone alive. She gave away more than most people will ever earn, and she still couldn't make her monuments outlive her, because beauty was never the thing that carries a fortune forward. The machine is. There is one small mercy in all of this. Hillwood, the Washington estate the Smithsonian handed back, did not vanish. Her foundation reopened it as a public museum, charging admission, running tours, and paying its own way, the way an institution has to. The one monument of hers that survived whole is the one that was, in the end, forced to earn its keep. Even her own legacy proves the rule. The treasure that lasted is the treasure that learned to carry itself. Which raises a harder question, the one worth sitting with. If the richest woman in America couldn't keep her palace in the family, what chance does an ordinary inheritance really have? Thanks for watching all the way to the end. If this story stuck with you, subscribe and turn on notifications, because there's one more heiress whose story makes even this one look gentle. A woman called the richest girl in the world in her own time, who inherited younger than Marjorie and with even more money, and who ended her life in a way almost no fortune should have allowed. That one is coming next.